Now we have to go back a bit and understand what steam technology was like in 1815. This is the 19th century we're talking about. And, it wasn't really the best. I mean, the technology was still very, very new. And people were still getting their feet wet when it came to the technology and figuring out how it worked and what it was good at and what it wasn't good at and the potential. It was still very, very new territory when it came to science and engineering and everything like that. So understand that the reason why this explosion happened wasn't necessarily due to ineptitude. It was due to ignorance, because they just didn't know what they were dealing with. Safety standards hadn't been established, and more importantly, the limitations of the technology had not yet been established. As we all know, steam engines are built off of a pressure-based system. The power comes from steam pressure. Now, the inherent danger here that has to be rectified is that anything under pressure is capable of just exploding, bursting, whatever you want to call it. There's always that kind of concern. Now, with understood mechanics, you can build a product that won't result in such a catastrophic failure. And in fact, it's important to mention that the steam boiler explosion we're talking about with this particular locomotive was based off of the boiler integrity failing. This is very rare, especially when you get to the 20th century. By that point, the understanding of the limitations of the materials involved when it came to constructing a steam locomotive were well understood. And in fact, steam explosions due to boiler failure were nearly unheard of in that time frame. But that was not so in the early 1800s. Again, back then they didn't know the limitations of what is effectively a container you stick your pressurized steam into. They didn't know what the limits of those materials were. So it was possible to put the pressure just a bit too high and cause a rupture and therefore an explosion. And that is exactly what happened in 1815 in Philadelphia. Now, I keep saying Philadelphia, and I probably should clarify for my American audience. I am not talking about Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I am talking about Philadelphia, County Durham, England, in what is now the UK. So, not the Philadelphia that American audiences would immediately think of. This is a completely different Philadelphia, over across the Atlantic, with our friends over in the United Kingdom. Hi guys, I know you're listening. We're talking about your Philadelphia, and your steam explosion. You had the first one. Congratulations. I don't know if that's really something to brag about, but you did invent the technology, so it kind of makes sense that you would also have the first major mishap with it. So I don't think anyone should come down too hard in the UK. Alright, I'm just saying. I'm just defending my guys over across the seas and looking out for you people. I get mad at British Rail enough, but I don't need to make more enemies over there. Now, the locomotive in question was known as Brunton's Mechanical Traveller, which... Okay, I suddenly realized some major context may be required for this particular thing. The Mechanical Traveller was an invention by William Brunton. He was a Scottish engineer and inventor. And it did not operate like any steam locomotive you have probably ever seen in your life. But again, this was early, when the technology was new, and we didn't really know what the heck we were trying to do with it. We were just trying for anything. Brunton's idea here was to quite literally emulate a horse with two mechanical legs that were powered by the steam engine. And I'm gonna give it to him here. It was constructed in 1813, and for him to actually figure out a way for a steam engine to work two mechanical legs, I mean, he basically made a steampunk Metal Gear, alright? You know, it wasn't nearly that big, but you get my point. Like, the mechanical nature of this actually fascinates me. It had to have been a trying effort to get it to work the way it does. And it did function. Like, it did move forward. The legs were the drive, and it moved itself forward on rails, but it could only go about 3 miles per hour. So it was also about as fast as a walking horse, but I guess that's to be expected. It was designed to run on wagonways, which differ from railways slightly. Wagonways were also a set of rails, effectively, but they didn't have ties like we think of when it comes to modern railways. They were kind of built like into the ground or sometimes just on the ground, and they were used to keep the wagons steady while either cables or horses pulled them up from a mine shaft, for example. The Mechanical Traveller was meant to be a mechanized version of that. And I guess if you really want to get technical, it still can be called a railway, but just not the way we would think of them. It's also probably pretty obvious that this particular design never really took off because, well, I think it's obvious. This just wasn't going to work, nearly as effectively as what would become the modern steam engine. Like, the top speed, the power output, the act of mechanizing actual physical legs with steam power, it was way too complicated for its own good and at no gain. But again, early technology, people were trying a whole bunch of stuff, and I gotta commend William Brunton for his creativity here and just making it work at all. Like, honestly, I'd be curious to see a recreation of it just to see a little steam engine walking with a pair of legs like that. Like, that'd be neat. But you're here for the big boom, the explosion. What happened? Well, in 1815, the Mechanical Traveller was out being tested in Philadelphia, County Durham, England. Now, sources are limited on this because it was such an isolated incident. Normally, steam explosions only affect the crew on board, but in this case, there was a crowd of onlookers around, and at least 13 people were killed. Some sources say it was high as 16, it goes back and forth. The cause of the explosion was due to a boiler rupture. When the pressure gets too high in a boiler, they explode. That's a thing that happens. Now, there are ways to prevent this, but there are also many causes. In the Mechanical Traveller's case, it actually had safety valves installed specifically to prevent this problem. However, apparently those safety valves were actually screwed down too tightly, and this prevented them from going off, resulting in the boiler giving way well before the safety valves warned of the danger. The result is, well, it killed at least 13 people, and completely threw the Mechanical Traveller project out the window. Nobody is willing to rebuild it or even test it further. And to be fair, it never would have amounted to much because, pushing a locomotive around with a pair of legs is not nearly as good as what we know steam engines to be nowadays. So, it was never going to work out, but it's kind of a shame that it had to result in a few people's deaths. But in its defense, it wasn't like the Mechanical Traveller's legs were the reason for the explosion. That had nothing to do with it. It was a safety valve problem. And believe me, there are other steam explosions in the 1800s on more practical style steam locomotives that also suffered similar failures. So it's not like Mechanical Traveller is necessarily unique in that regard. It just is unlucky enough to be the first one. So with that, till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.